Good morning, everyone, here at Kulturhuset in Oslo, and also to all of you who are watching us online. And welcome to this breakfast seminar hosted by CICERO Center for International Climate Research. My name is Kårstein Måsæde. I'm Department Director at CICERO. This morning, we're going to learn about how carbon uptake is changing in Norway and how it might be affected by climate change. Norwegian forests and land areas absorb large amounts of carbon dioxide every year. However, this carbon uptake has unexpectedly declined by about 40% in the last decade. This means that now more carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, climate targets might be at risk, and it also leads to additional global warming. And Norway is not alone either. This happens simultaneously now in many European countries that see the similar type of trends. There are several factors at play: aging forests, increased harvest, but maybe also impacts of climate change like droughts and bark beetle attacks. We're going to hear and learn more about these during this morning's session. Also, most of the carbon stock sits in the soil. Could it be that this would be released in a warmer climate, or will it be lost to rivers and lakes as land cover changes? So that's the land part, but also Norway has a long coast and is responsible for large ocean areas. And the coastal and ocean zone is currently not considered in Norway's carbon accounting. So as you understand, there are many unanswered questions here. Fortunately, we have a new project that's just starting up with this meeting that's going to try to address many of these questions. NorSink is the name of the project. It's a CICERO-led project that in the coming years will provide the most comprehensive assessment of Norway's carbon budget to date, both to understand the drivers of the change, but also to model the potential future impacts of climate change. We don't do this alone. We do this in partnership with strong scientists from other institutes, from NIBIO, the Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy, from NIVA, the Norwegian Institute of Water Research, the University of Oslo, NILU, and NTNU. And this project is a bit special. It's what the Research Council that's funding this calls a large interdisciplinary project. And that also means that one of the goals of the project is to unify and structure the Norwegian research community that works on the carbon cycle. So hence, we will, over the lifetime of the project, also invite in and engage with a broader research and stakeholder community. So now I'm pleased to hand over to Kjetil Aas, Senior Researcher at CICERO, who will guide us through the rest of this session. Please, Kjetil.
Yes, thank you, and great to see you all here. I've been looking forward to this day. We have a great program, and quite packed program, I must say, for the next 1.5 hours. And we will take the 4 talks and then open up for a bit of questions, have dialogue here on the stage, and then go for 4 new talks. And we will dive right in. So I would like to welcome Glenn Peters, who is a senior researcher at CICERO and member of the Global Carbon Project Leader Group, leading the NorSink project. And I can think of a few other people who are more well-suited to give the overall talk to start off this day. So Glenn, please.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody, which is essentially a kick-off for this new project, NorSink, which started on the 1st of April, actually. I'm going to give a bit of an introductory talk and talk about global carbon budgets, regional carbon budgets, and our national carbon budgets, which is zooming into Norway, and my colleagues will talk about the rest of the detail and all the exciting stuff afterwards. So this is the global carbon budget. We update and publish this every year around about November, and it looks at the global picture. This is the anthropogenic or human part of the carbon budget, and essentially we do a detailed accounting of what are the sources and sinks of carbon in and out of the atmosphere. So in terms of the sources, which are the arrows, the big flows in and out of the system, we have burning of fossil fuels in the grey, land use change in the little orangey colour there, which is much smaller. These go into the atmosphere and then taken back up in the land sector. In the land is the sink, land sink, and then up in the ocean there's also a lot taken up, and the remaining stays in the atmosphere. I'll have another figure showing how this has changed over time. So these are the main flows in and out of the into the system. There's the circles on this figure are showing the stocks, how much carbon there is in volume in these different parts of the system. And you can see there's a very big circle in the ocean. There's a lot of carbon sitting in the ocean. A lot of carbon sitting in soils, a lot more in soils than in vegetation, for example. There's carbon in surface sediments in the ocean, shallow ocean or deep ocean. And there's coal, oil and gas reserves, which are actually smaller than some of these stocks. And this is also an important consideration when we look at the parts of the carbon budget. So this is for the last decade. We can zoom in and look at the last, or over time, from the pre-industrial period. This figure goes back to 1800 and shows how these different components have changed. So the big source of carbon into the atmosphere is from burning fossil fuels, land use change, deforestation, minus afforestation, and so on. That's been relatively constant over hundreds of years. And these are what we call the anthropogenic emissions. So when we talk about net zero emissions, for example, it's these parts at the top which need to go to zero. And then we have the sinks at the bottom, the ocean sink, the land sink, and then the remaining in the atmosphere. And the ocean and land sink take up about half our emissions, and about half remains in the atmosphere, which causes climate change. The ocean and land sinks are a response to the system, so they are growing over time as a consequence of our fossil and land use emissions changing over time. So that's the global carbon budget, and we study that in a lot of detail. As I mentioned, we publish a report every year, the global carbon budget, in November, which adds another year and tries to understand what's going on with this system, if we're missing any sources and sinks, and so on. The next level of complexity, and much more policy relevant, is to zoom into regional carbon budgets. So instead of looking at the global picture, we go into, let's say in this figure here, continents, South America, Africa, Australasia, and also different parts of the ocean. And things get much more complex when you go to the regional level. You need to consider flows between the regions. We have flows in the atmosphere, carbon being transferred through wind and so on. You have flows in the ocean, carbon going in between these different zones. We also have international trade. So we're exporting and importing crops and wood products and so on. So when you look at the regional budgets, you need to consider those flows. And you also have flows, for example, in rivers, between countries or regions, and into the ocean. So much more complex. You start to need different modelling tools, different data sets, but it's much more policy relevant. And then the next generation is to go to the country level. And this is what some colleagues have done for Australia, or Australasia. And it's quite detailed. I'm not going to spend the next hour trying to explain every arrow here, but just to say what some of the broad parts here and how it's different to the global picture. So here they've got oceans, so the exclusive economic zone of Australia, what's going on there. We've got the coastal zone and estuaries, so this is bringing in things like blue carbon and so on. Freshwaters, rivers, lakes, and so on, that's also considered. Probably the biggest part is the terrestrial ecosystem, so basically the land, which is cropland, grassland, which is huge in Australia, forests, and so on. We have these flows out of Australia or into Australia, but generally out, which is flow of or exports of wood products, exports of crops and livestock, and so on. And there's geological parts over here. There is some carbon uptake in rocks and things like that, but also the fossil fuel element, and all the arrows and connections between these components. So that is, if you could say, the current state of the art, looking at the historical budget for a country. This here is a carbon budget of Norway, which is done by Helene, who's somewhere here and will be talking later there. This was done actually 10 years ago, and you'll see a nice version of this figure in colour, I noticed. later. But this is sort of where things are at Norway. It's also given some regional detail based on catchments, water catchments and so on. And the goal in this project is to redo this, make it much more detailed and look at it over time, so not just in the historical period, but also think about and try and understand how it will change as we move into the future. And I'll finish up there and hand over to my colleagues. The next one will be Christian. Thank you.
Yes, so I'll talk a little bit just about the national accounting for the land use change and forestry sector. That is this sector that is in negative here. It's the uptake sector. So one of the things you quickly see is that here you have the other sectors and there's a slow decline, but what you see here is the net, this dotted line here, and you can see it fluctuates up and down, and that's largely because of the trends that you're seeing here for the LULUCF sector. So just a little quick about how we report for the LULUCF sector. It is based on a sampling approach. There's 22,008 permanent plots in Norway that are used, that are being monitored by the National Forest Inventory Program. About approximately 13,000 are forest land plots, and 1/5 are monitored each year. If there are trees actually on the plot, they will actually physically go there and monitor them. Otherwise, we use aerial to determine which land use category they are. Yes, and then from this, we can then track over time the different land use changes and the development of the forest. You combine this with other overlay maps and climate zones and statistics from Norway, other statistics, use the guidelines from the IPCC, and this is used then to report the emissions in the UN's common reporting tables. And we then have finally a report that is published by the the Norwegian Environment Agency. So if you look at the LULUCF sector, you'll see that a very important part of the land use category is the forest land. It is the part which is actually contributing to the uptake. And if you look a little closer at the forest land, you see it's the living biomass. This is the trees that is responsible for the uptake. But you see also there's litter and dead wood. And the way it is that all the trees contribute to litter input, and this litter is decomposing over time. The important thing is that what you see is that there is a trend that it's been increasing the uptake. So negative is uptake. And in recent years, since 2010 approximately, it's been declining. And on the other side, you see that the litter has been increasing and the deadwood hasn't been increasing. So the main trends is that if we split the forest and look at only the living biomass, you can see here in green, we have the uptake. This is how much the trees are sequestering of carbon. This is the gains. And over here on the above, this is the emissions or the losses. These are in orange harvest, and here's the natural mortality. And the natural mortality has slowly been increasing over time because the forest is getting older. But particularly in the last couple of years, it's been increasing. Additionally, also the harvest has been increasing. And what we can also see is that the actual gains has also been declining, ever so slightly. But that's enough that you see this trend that we're slowly losing our uptake. Another thing that's worth keeping in mind is that we also have land use changes. And here you can see the cumulative changes from 1990 to 2023. And you'll see there's more forest that's lost than we are gaining forest. And when you look specifically at what kind of forest is lost, it's the high productive forest that's being lost. This is the deforestation. And we're having a gain in unproductive forest up in the mountain areas. So this is largely coming from what we call extensive grasslands, which is these rangelands up in the mountains. But overall, you see that the deforestation here in orange still is a very small percentage compared to what is here MF, the forest management. That being said, every time you do forest management, you cut down trees, you plant new trees, so there's new trees to take over and increase the uptake again. But deforestation, that's lost. So over time, this will have a larger impact on the forest. Yes. Okay, then there's, in addition to doing the accounting, which you see here, we also do long-term projections. And these long-term projections are not there to capture, like, oh, is there going to be a drought and so forth, but they're supposed to give an estimate of what is the business as usual harvest rate and land use changes, and then do a prognosis of how this will develop over time. And as you can see, here was what we saw. We had the peak around 2010, where we had an uptake of minus 26 million tons. And then this has continuously been declining. These sharp peaks and valleys are due to harvest. And we are now at about minus 15 million tons. And it's expected to continuously decline to about 2050. As we continue with the harvest and there's an increase in natural mortality, those trees will slowly lose the living biomass. And but eventually, after 2050, new trees, the younger trees, will then grow to a much more mature age where they actually start contributing again to the uptake. And you'll see that most of the dynamics is in the living biomass and the dead wood and dead organic matter and mineral soil. And the reason is there is a we can go to the next slide here. You can see that the dead wood is increasing and the litter is increasing. So when the trees, as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, they produce more litter, but as also there's an increase in natural mortality, there's more dead wood added. When the harvest starts declining, all this dead wood and litter there's less coming in and there's more going out. So eventually this stock here will also continuously, less and less uptake will be observed. So it's a combination of this living biomass trends and the decomposition and adding of litter and dead wood. Recalculations and methodologies, we have continuously improvements in the greenhouse gas inventory. We have reviews from the UN, and as we get new reviews, there has to be improvements added to the improvements in methodologies and upgrades, and this causes changes in the trends. There's also the issue that we only measure 1/5 of the plots every year, so there has to be done some sort of extrapolation in the last years, so often the last years have the greatest uncertainty. And this will continue as we get newer. We're already in a review process this year, so there will be even further improvements in the future. And there are new categories that will come in. Rewetting is one of them. There has not been observed yet on any of the 22,008 plots restoration, but there is restoration going on. But once there's enough of it, it will be picked up in the sampling. And flooded lands is another area. That's from hydro plants. There's a degassing happens at the points of these, in addition to degassing that happens actually here in the reservoir, especially at the points of the dams, there is a release of methane. And this will likely have to be counted very soon because we need to do that for the second commitment period for the EU. And then there's this discussion also on coastal wetlands, which is another aspect, which also will eventually have to be considered to be added. So things will change over time. And with that, I thank you. And yeah.
Thank you, Christian and Glenn. And I think we've had a nice set now for the rest of the talks, seeing both the global picture and the Norwegian current state of affairs. So next out is Ryan Bright on drought and bark beetles. Ryan is a senior science researcher at NIBIO. Go ahead.
Thank you, Seto. Good morning, everyone. You might be asking yourselves why this talk, why this question you see on the screen before you. Well, that is because in 2018 began one of the worst spruce bark beetle outbreaks in Central European history. Ravaged more than 200 million cubic meters of European spruce forests. To put that into perspective, that's about 50% of all the spruce forest we have, the volume we have in Norway, or about 1/4 about a quarter century or 25 years worth of spruce commercial harvest. So we're talking about a lot of biomass lost. This resulted in increased harvest levels, and that in turn has consequences for the European forest carbon sink. So the sink has been reduced quite a bit as a result of this major natural disturbance event. So before we can address why it occurred, I think it's important to understand or look a little bit at what drives these spruce bark beetle populations. And that is, on the left side here, a combination of climate, namely temperatures, which are very important to the spruce beetle biology, determining the lifespan, life cycle length, the number of generations it can have in a growing season, et cetera, et cetera. But like any other living organism, these spruce bark beetles need nourishment, and they get that in the form of the phloem of the spruce trees, which is just found under the bark. And while healthy trees have natural defense mechanisms to like sap production to help ward off infestation, this declines as trees age or become stressed for other environmental reasons. So then why did this outbreak occur, this large outbreak occur around 2018? Well, many of you in this room probably remember in 2018, throughout much of Europe, Central and Southern Europe, Southern Northern Europe, we experienced an extreme drought, maybe around in Norway, I think we're calling it 1 in 100 year drought. And this had this brought very anomalously warm and dry conditions throughout much of Central and Southern Northern Europe. And this did two things. One, it provided the conditions that were highly favorable to spruce beetle biology. But these dry conditions are also very unfavorable or detrimental to spruce forests, spruce biology, leaving many of the spruce forests in Europe more susceptible and vulnerable to attack. So while this extreme drought might have been the catalyst, amplifying this epidemic, it's important to keep in mind that there's a human component into this whole picture here, okay? And that is essentially our preference for spruce as a commercial species. The widespread adoption of spruce-dominant forestry practices throughout Europe following World War II has resulted today in thousands of hectares of spruce forests throughout these regions. And much of these areas are actually where spruce is very maladapted. And also, these forests are also reaching maturity, so becoming, slightly weakened in their defense. So now, armed with the knowledge of the cascading interactions between drought and spruce bark beetles, what can we say now about the prognosis for Norway? So let's start with assessing the future drought risk. The figure on the right here shows you the spatial pattern and the change in the frequency of extremely dry conditions occurring during the growing season at the end of a moderate climate change mitigation scenario, or RCP 4.5. The drought risk to spruce becomes particularly clear when one combines this with the knowledge of where most of the spruce forests are located in Norway, as well as insight into where spruce healthy functioning is adversely impacted by drought or extreme dryness conditions, which you see here in the red. So when we combine these pictures, we see that spruce are very vulnerable to drought. Turning our attention to the human component, here we see that around 28% of the productive forest area is spruce, and that the growing stock of spruce on this area has almost doubled in 70 years. So lots of fodder here, can we say, or resource potential for beetles. We also see in the far left that this stock is generally growing older, and which if you recall is linked to a weakened immune system. And we also see in the bottom right panel that spruce are rather well connected in the region. This is southeast Norway here, so this is a region where spruce are more vulnerable to drought conditions. these forests are rather well connected. So the darker the red means the more connectivity for spruce to invade, I guess, or where outbreaks potentials are largest. So I guess, given the current forest vulnerability levels and the increased drought risk and a moderate warming scenario in Norway, if we can then combine these with the increased volcanism, we can say for the same scenario at the end of the century, we can, it's a disturbing or not so comforting picture emerges. So increased volcanism means that then basically projections for how the biology of the beetle is changing. So we see at the end of the century, towards the end of the century, much of the spruce region is switching from a one generation to a two generation behavior or regime. And we see quite a long overlap with where the spruce forests are, and vulnerable spruce forests in particular. So this is, this is not a comforting picture. So to summarize, climate warming, again, favors spruce bark beetle biology. Norway has an abundance of old spruce residing in drought-prone regions. Extreme droughts amplify this risk of large outbreaks of spruce bark beetle, as we saw 7 years ago in Central Europe. And I would argue that it's not a matter of if we have a large outbreak, it's a matter of when and how devastating it will be. And that's one of the things in NorSync we will be looking at, is to sort of estimate, are we talking about the next decade, have such a large outbreak as Central Europe did, or is it more towards the end of the century? And are we talking about the size of Norway's worst outbreak, which occurred in the late 70s, of about 5 million cubic meters, or are we talking something much larger? So that's something we can hopefully put our fingers on in NorSync. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ryan. Scary stuff. And I would like to dive into questions, but we will have one more talk before we do that. And you also feel free to prepare your questions. So Norbert Pirk is entering the stage here. He is associate professor at the University of Oslo, and he is heavily involved in monitoring carbon fluxes. So you will talk about carbon flux monitoring. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Kjetil, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Let's see if this works. It used to work an hour ago. Now it doesn't. Oh, sorry, there was a cable that was not in. There we go. Oh, yep. Right. Sorry for being complicated as a Mac person. How can we better monitor carbon fluxes in real time is the question I was asked to talk about. And I will give you a very subjective, personal answer to this question, and I'm sure you're going to have opinions about this yourselves as well. But firstly, I wanted to say, which fluxes do I talk about, or which fluxes do I mean? And generally, when I think about fluxes, I think about the vertical exchange of CO2 and methane on the surface. So you have this infinitesimally small surface, and there is an exchange going on in terms of uptake by the vegetation and release by the microbes or the respiration. Then the question is, why would you want to measure these fluxes? Why would anyone be interested in this? And one of the main reasons for this is these land surface models that we have, which are very complex. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of small errors and processes that we try to capture in land surface models. And this complexity needs to be parameterized. So we put simple equations, lump together all this information that we have and put this into parameters. These parameters needs to be tuned. So we don't know these values beforehand. And in order to tune them, you have to go out into the world and look at what you can, or you have to tune them to observations. Now you could use like soil organic carbon stocks. You could look how much carbon is there in the soil, and then try to match your parameters in the model so that they match. Or you can look at fluxes. It turns out that fluxes are a very informative way to tune model parameters. Now, if you want to monitor this in real time, you need some kind of measurement principle or some kind of system that works automatically, because we really don't want to go out there and take manual measurements. This is almost prohibitive. So one way of doing this is that you look at the surface here, and maybe there's some sun that shines on the surface and some wind blowing over it. And then you need to think a little bit about atmospheric turbulence. So this is the principle that we use, is essentially how does the air move over the surface. Now, if you look at, for example, a cross-section of temperature here, so you slice up this box and you look at the temperature field, it may look like this. So you see turbulent fluctuations in air temperatures. And this is because the sun heats the surface here. So there's these plumes or these thermals that rise from the ground, and the wind is slowly blowing over this. Now this is temperature, but I thought this was more instructive to show you a temperature field. But a CO2 or methane field would look very similar. If there was a source of CO2 here, you could imagine these red blobs to represent higher concentrations of CO2. Now I'm going to show you the exact same simulation one more time. But I'm going to pretend that there is a sensor here at one point. Here it's, I don't know, at 80 meters above ground level. There's one sensor that can measure temperature. And here you will see the temperature time series. The twist to the story is that this sensor not only measures the temperature, but it also measures the wind, specifically the vertical wind speed. So if air parcels move upwards or downwards. And if I start the simulation now, you will see these time series popping up here that are by this simulated pretended sensor. You already see that there's some correlation between these two variables. If I plot this as a scatter plot, where now here goes the temperature and here goes this vertical wind, it's the same data, just plotted as a scatter plot. You see over half an hour or so, you see this correlation appearing here. And this correlation is there because there is this surface flux, this surface heat flux, that causes the vertical wind and the temperature to be positively correlated. And the exact same principle would apply to CO2 or methane or any other passive tracer that you could think of in the atmosphere. If there is a source of something, there's a positive correlation. If there is a sink on the surface, you would see a negative correlation. If there is no flux, you would see no correlation. And this is what we call eddy covariance or eddy correlation technique. Now the question is, this is a nice simulation, but could this actually work in reality? Yes, people do this. Here, for example, is maybe not so easily visible, but this is a 150-meter tall tower in northern Sweden with a lot of sensors that measure exactly that. They measure gas concentrations, temperatures, and wind speeds. And they can calculate this eddy correlation flux. If your canopy is a bit smaller, like maybe here on Svalbard, where you only have a few centimeters of canopy, your tower can be a bit smaller. But the same principle applies. It's actually exactly the same ratio between sensor height and canopy height. Also, you can do this in campaigns. So you can move these systems around. Here, this is one system which has been used a lot at my department, which we've used in different places to see how much CO2 is coming out of the soil or these different ecosystems. You can also employ them in long-term monitoring. And this here is a slide that was kindly provided by Holger Lange at NIBU, because he's responsible for this ICOS tower in Hyrdal, which is in this, close to the airport. And he actually calculated even a derivative, so that's the cumulative carbon exchange. So he took all these half-hour estimates of carbon fluxes and summed them over the year. So you can see how when you start here at January 1st, you first have this period where the ecosystem is releasing carbon, then the growing season starts, it's taking up carbon. Maybe here you have some extreme event like Hans or so coming in, so you see a little hop there, and then the growing season stops and the winter starts again. And you can see how these, and he monitors this over different years, and we will see how 2025 will look like, if this may even become a source of CO2. Now, to come back to my original question, how can we better monitor carbon fluxes in real time? I think this eddy covariance technique is not the silver bullet. there are many issues with it and a lot of research going on. We've got gaps in the data that needs to be modeled and filled. These systems are expensive. One of these towers costs in the order of 2 million kroner, or just the instruments, and they're also very sparse. I mean, we have a few hundred of them in the world, but this is not nearly enough to tune climate models. So I think we need to really leverage other parts of the observing system and potentially use these keys or these pieces that we have collectively and optimize our observing system as we collect new information to tune these parameters. So this hopefully will allow landscape heterogeneity to appear, and that would then lead to better flux estimates and better better tuned parameters. Thank you.
Thank you, Norbert. You can stay up here, and we will invite the other 3 speakers. I must say I'm a bit jealous on your slides there. I'm impressed.
To bring it a Mac.
Yeah, okay, it's a Mac. Yeah, I'll blame it on the Mac. I like a Mac. Okay, yeah, maybe you join the other speakers here. And
I have to stay here, maybe.
yeah, I'll kick it off. We have about 10 minutes now where we can discuss what we've talked about so far and get some questions from the audience, and then we will have the next 4 speakers diving a bit more into the soil and the ocean system. But I want to start with Norbert, the last speaker, because you showed here the eddy covariance measurements and the other more real-time measurements. And so far we have been looking at, like, Norway is well equipped with this landskogstakseringen, like the National Forest Inventory. We have a very good history of that. But eddy covariance towers, we are not very well equipped. You showed Hurdal, which is now an ICO site, but do you want to reflect a bit on, like, how are these complementary? What are there, like, is there a challenge that we don't have more of these eddy covariance stations?
Yeah, good question. So 10 years ago or so, we established the first eddy covariance tower in Norway, or maybe there was Andøya before also, but in Finse, and it was a bit of a mystery because Sweden and Finland, for example, they are quite relatively well populated with eddy covariance stations. Both of these countries, for some reason, they have history or I don't know, some kind of strategy towards monitoring their ecosystems with eddy covariance. Norway didn't have that. My personal hypothesis was sometimes that it is due to heterogeneity and topography, that which technically violates the eddy covariance principle. So it didn't really lend itself to maybe being used in Norway. But at the same time, we were just going blind in terms of fluxes, at least in Norway. No one knew what these ecosystems were doing. Then now it started, and Holger has nicely equipped some sites, and there's also other groups now in Trondheim and Bergen that use it. So it's coming, and I think these networks are building. And then you're absolutely right. I mean, merging this with information from the stocks, from the soil inventories and satellite information, this must be the way forward to combine this. And then we need a good model that can ingest all of this information.
Yep. Do you want to comment, Christian? You know the Norwegian, like, operational reporting of fluxes probably better than.
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, the National Forest Inventory is very good when we looks at the long term, because we are measuring. The first campaign was from 1986 to 1993, and then it's been continuing after that on every year, but only a fifth of the plots, which means you get some sort of smoothing effect. You don't actually get annual measurements. If you try to have to interpolate between 2 points that are every time measured at 5 years, and there's 5 panels. So you get some nice long-term trends, but it's really when you start looking into what are these events happening, such as droughts and declining growth. So for instance, like the 2018 event, how could you really, it's not easy to see that with the National Forest Inventory, because part of the data is before, part of the data is on the year, part of it is, so what you get is a sort of smoothing. You can't really see this direct. This is the growth on that year, and then it's so you can sort of maybe in the long run, as years go by, start seeing the effect of this event in this period that has an approach. But yeah, you start lacking a lot of information when it comes to the timeliness.
Yep.
And also the fact that it's 1/5 means that the last 4 years don't actually have a complete observation. There's still plots that have not been observed this year. Only there's only 1/5 that has been observed for 2023, and the 4/5 have not been observed. So you do lack some information of what's actually happening right now. So it is a little bit of a case where you need some sort of synergy between different methods to get this timely resolution.
Yep. Do you want to add something here, Ryan? I mean, the scary plots you show and your analysis of what we need to prepare for. I mean, are we prepared to? Are we monitoring this in a good enough way? Will we catch it in real time when there is a massive bark beetle outbreak?
Yeah, I think we're relatively prepared. I mean, we already are quite good about salvaging and doing sanitary harvesting when we do see small patch outbreaks. I guess, but that's the scale. So we're prepared for the scale that occurs today. But what I'm uncertain about is whether one can coordinate salvaging at such a scale that would be needed if there was something that we saw in Central Europe happening in southern Norway. I think there's a lot of Norway's topography is more complex, and it would require a bit more coordination, a bit more organizing. Probably a lot of areas wouldn't be possible to salvage. So but generally, I think we have the monitoring systems. We have the traps, the beetle trap monitoring system that's been in place for over a decade now, and we have I think we have good systems in place to alert us to when there's starting to be coming outbreaks.
Yep. And okay, I'll hold my next question and see if there are someone in the audience who wants to jump in now. So maybe start with saying who you are, where you come from, and then your question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Line Venn from the magazine Norwegian Forestry. I just wondered if the monitoring system that you are telling about, the fluxes, are your curves or your figures based on that kind of system, or is it based on the landskogtakseringen and similar systems in other countries? And are the curves that you are showing based on the same monitoring system in all countries, so we can compare them? Yeah.
Yep. Will you take the next question first?
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good.
It's a hard question.
Give you some time to think. Yep.
Good morning. My name is Ruth Astrid Sæther, and I'm working as a moderator for different climate and energy conferences. So in this setting, I'm more like a concerned citizen. Thank you so much for very interesting presentations. And I was just wondering, this is probably a question to Norbert and Christian, when it comes to monitoring, how precise are they? I mean, could we be using satellite data more often? Christian, you mentioned that we only see 1/5 of the plots every year. Is that a question of funding, or is it a question of too much data that has to be processed? Why is this happening at such a cycle? And also, I was wondering, Brian, was it? Yeah. When it comes to the bark beetles, I mean, we even have a boogie about the bark beetle in Norway, so it's well known. Yeah. And you're giving us a rather gloomy picture of what's going to happen, but how can we stop them? I mean, do we have measures to preventing attacks, or is that just it's a natural disaster that's going to happen? Thank you.
Okay, I think we will take. There was a final question there. I don't know if it was a question from Holger also, or a comment. Comment. And then I'll let Glenn start answering, and we have like a few more minutes before we go to the next session. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Håvard Åsli. I work in Fossagrim. I have a question about the bark beetles as well. The attacks in Europe are mostly on planted spruce forests. Do you see a difference on planted spruce forests versus more naturally regenerated spruce forest in Scandinavia?
Okay, I would like to make the comment on bark beetle detection. We at NIBU are running a so-called early stage detection service, which is using Sentinel-2 imagery, which is updated every other day. So there is a map of Norway where you can see the development of the bark beetle according to the satellite images with high frequency, so to speak. The idea is to enable foresters to do salvage cuts. So if they discover, if the maps show a patch of recently infested trees, they could go out and harvest these infested trees to prevent further spread of the disease. The project is ongoing, and so far we are not completely satisfied with the results, in the sense that the delay between the actual infestation and the detection according to our algorithm is still a couple of weeks, which might be a lot during the summer, but we are trying to increase this and to come up with a near real-time discovery.
Thank you. And this is Holger Lange, responsible also for the ICOS site that Norbert mentioned. But yes, Glenn.
Yeah, so I'll touch on some of the response to a couple of the questions there, but I guess different data products are showing different sorts of results. So you see with the inventory that Christian showed, that's primarily based on the forest inventory, not using the flux towers or whatever, but in the last 5 years, this issue with the frequency of visiting sites, there's other data used to supplement in the last 5 years. If you look at some of the stuff with the, let's say, land surface models, which Rosie will talk about later, they'll be assimilating some information from flux towers. But then the Norwegian flux tower has a shorter time series than one in, say, Sweden, which is longer. So you have those sorts of issues. Some of the inversion systems, where people look at what's going on in the atmosphere and try and figure out what's going on by running the model backwards, in a sense. You know, they have some specific sites where there's measurements or estimates of concentrations, but they're also starting to assimilate satellite data, but that's only in the last few years. And I think, and maybe Rosie will talk about this at the end, part of the challenge with the modelling is how do you assimilate all these different data streams, which are all showing something different. You know, you'll have the Herdal in Norway, maybe you've got some, your sites, you'll have some satellites, you'll have some inventories data around. So how can you bring all this data together and have the best possible picture of what's happening? And I think that's the sort of the next, I guess, generation of research and what we're actively trying to solve, how to bring everything together and get a robust picture.
So we'll make sure to ask Rosie that in the end. How do we do this? Yeah. There were more questions.
I can just comment on the thing about resolution, and this is I think on one hand, the NFI plots, what is monitored on the plot is very high. I mean, you're measuring individual trees, you are measuring a lot, you're measuring the deadwood, you're actually following the loss, and statistically, because there's so many samples, 13,000 of our actual tree measurement samples, you do have a pretty good good sampling, statistically have good sampling of forest land and also other arts area which have trees. Then it's the resolution that's a bit of an issue because it's being monitored every 5th year. But we've already started some steps into trying to improve the last years where we don't have full observations, where we are trying to use remote sensing data to see whether or not some of these plots which have yet not been monitored will be monitored for loss. So we've been using like a product called Global Forest Watch, or there's another product called Global Forest Change, but it's the same thing, where you actually can see loss. But there are false positives and false negatives. Not always it's a clear-cut harvest, and you can't tell whether it's deforestation or whether it's just harvest. Also, remote sensing tends to be in the summer years when they have clear cover, but you can have harvest that's happening in the autumn. But it's the same problem for those who are going out in the field. They can also be going in the field in spring, and the harvest happens later on. So there's a lot of like small technical problems with all these methods. It's really the combination of different techniques that could help improve the resolution and maybe improve better insight to what are these processes that are happening.
Good. I think with a final answer before we move to the next one, are you going to...
Quick response?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, please.
The question was about mitigation. yes, there are some things we can do in Norway, which would be, for example, moving up harvesting schedules a bit forward in time on the most vulnerable spruce areas in the south of Norway, south of Telemark, Buskerud, for example. Maybe less clear-cut edges, trees along the edges, they become vulnerable, I guess, exposed. So yeah, there are some things that can be done there. To your excellent question, I haven't looked into it in Norway, but one of the reasons why we had this problem in Europe, I think, because there were a lot of plantations where there probably shouldn't have been. So the trees there were less adapted naturally to ward off such an attack. I haven't looked at the differences between plantation spruce areas in Norway versus sort of natural regenerated areas, but it's a good question, and I hope to look into it in this project. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, and maybe a round of applause. Then we will get the non-Mac computer up on the stage, and we will move to soil carbon, rivers, ocean, and finally modeling. So next one out is Professor Terje Berntsen, who from University of Oslo, who was my supervisor and supervisor of many other great scientists. So you're about to get like a legend status, but now you get to talk about soil carbon modeling, and probably mention some of your PhD students here as well.
Definitely, yes.
Definitely. Go ahead, Terje.
Thanks, and thanks for coming. I'm going to talk about the part of the carbon, the land carbon that is in the soil. So Glenn showed this carbon budget that where you have the carbon, and in the boreal region there is much more carbon in the soils. So even if the rapid changes are in the living vegetation, the more long-term changes could be what was happening to the soil stocks. And in particular, in the long term, we will have a different climate. So we have the current monitoring systems, and that's very good for setting up models of the current system. But of course, what will happen in decades and even centuries ahead will be in a different setting. And to do this, we try to build models that are this land surface model. You had seen the abbreviation CLM, the community land model. That is the part of the Norwegian Earth System model, the land terrestrial part of the Norwegian Earth System model, where we are developing the soil carbon module to be better equipped to handle the changes in all of these factors that potentially could affect the soil carbon. So obviously the soil temperature will change with the length of the snow season, affecting also soil humidity by changing precipitation patterns, evaporation patterns. We could have changes in the water table, runoff rates, and even the elevated CO2 will have a fertilizing effect on the vegetation, affecting the input to the soils. And we will potentially change the whole forest ecology that I guess Rosie will touch more upon, the dynamic vegetation part of this land model. So I will talk about the soils. To put this in context, we have the Paris Agreement. And as you all know, that the goal is to keep the warming well below 2 degrees. And that means that we have to reduce the emissions. And that means that we have to reduce, and to know how much we have to reduce the emissions, we need to know what is called climate sensitivity. So let's say we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. What will be the new stable global warming level? And so we have so if you have 2 degrees, how much more carbon can we actually add to the atmosphere? And this depends on our understanding of the feedbacks in the system. And this soil carbon response is one of the potentially important feedbacks in the system. Are we going to, Glenn showed that at present the terrestrial system takes up about 20 to 30% of the global emissions, and maybe that will even flip and become a source of carbon, the terrestrial system. So these guys, the policymakers, they ask the questions to us, and our answer is pretty vague. We don't really know this climate sensitivity. So that's part of the motivation for improving the soil carbon decomposition models, not only to more the NorSync objective, which is more on the understanding the exact development of carbon in Norwegian soils. But we can use these models both for understanding the inventories we are making and also to scale it up more globally. So our tools to do this are these complex Earth system models. And in Norway, it's particularly then this, what we call the Norwegian Earth system model, which contains an atmospheric part, an ocean part, and this CLM, the community land model that we are working on. Several people in the audience here are working on that. And then we can put in the anthropogenic emissions and use that as a forcing, and we can simulate climate development into the future. And to do this, we then, in principle, need to understand also the soil carbon dynamics. So to do this, we of course have the vegetation that do photosynthesis, and there is input then to the soils. And this is all kinds of litter from the vegetation, but it's also a symbiotic relation between the vegetation and fungi in the soils. So there are also root exudates from feeding this community below the ground. And then these soil microbes, bacteria and fungi, they decompose the litter input. That's the source for their energy and their growth, and then respire back the CO2 that Norbert is measuring, also what is coming directly from the plants, of course. And then some of the residual here, when the dead microbes, they can go then into more stable forms of soil organic carbon. And this decomposition rates here is what we really need to know in these models, and they depend on the soil, the temperatures, the humidity, and also the nutrients. So our sort of now development is to try to model how much soil microbes we actually have in the system. And to do that, we need to know how much litter they get, and also the quality of the litter, how much nitrogen is in the litter, because these soil microbes also need nitrogen, and so there's a competition between the above ground vegetation and the soil microbes for these nutrients. I mentioned this symbiosis. So most plants, they live in a symbiotic relation to fungi, what is called a mycorrhizae fungi. So they use some of their sugars that they produce from the photosynthesis, give it to the fungi, and the fungi then mine for nutrients, mainly nitrogen and phosphorus. And some of that is given back to the plants, and some is used for growing the vegetation. And we tried then to incorporate this into the model. So this is what we're working on, and you see Betty here, and you can see her back in the audience, trying to couple now in a two-way fashion, and you don't need to know all these boxes, what's happening to the vegetation and what's happening to these soil microbial processes, and how this is then eventually how this is affected by temperatures and soils and soil moisture. We have done this offline to validate. That's an issue here that we don't have much validation data. So here is some previous work from Elin Aas on looking at litter bag decomposition, where you put actual litter into litter bags and you monitor, here's 100% initially, over 8 years, how they decompose, how rapidly they are decomposed. So this is on the cold site, and this is on the warm site in Canada. And you see that the model can pick up in the warmer site, it goes faster. So that we have some confidence in these models. Good, thanks.
Yes, thank you, Terje. We'll invite you up again. And then we have Helene de Witt, who did this work 10 years ago that we're now trying to replicate and hopefully fill out the picture. But you will talk about the rivers and runoff.
Yes, I'm very happy that we have this new project, so I'm no longer on my own. So I actually am a fairly terrestrial person who was trained as a soil scientist, and 20 years ago or so I moved to NIVA, where I focused on this soil-water interaction quite a bit. So one of the key issues in our Norsing project is questions about the lateral flux. Norbert talked about the vertical flux, the land-atmosphere interaction. Here we have the lateral flow of carbon, and trying to understand better how to fit that into the terrestrial carbon cycle. Right, yes. Okay, so this is a picture that Glenn showed earlier, and I suppose there's quite a few numbers here. So that was from the 2015 paper. And there we estimated how, based on national river monitoring data, how much rivers export to the coast. And the number here is 1.1 teragrams carbon per year. And if you compare that to other fairly robust numbers in these pictures, then the trees, based on the National Forest Inventory, very high quality data, is 4.8. And if you and then the soil in the forest and the peatlands, both of them are net sinks. So if you join them together, then that basically is almost the same number as what rivers export to the coast. So it must be said that for peatlands, we don't. This is based on literature studies, and the forest soils. Well, part of that was presented just earlier by Tarje. There are models to do that, and so it's very hard to do a direct estimation of soil carbon accumulation. So the fact that these two numbers are almost the same doesn't mean that you can simply take one and subtract the other, and then you end with zero. It's more complicated than that, and this is what we will be working on. But it's a huge number, and you should also remember that the coastal inputs from rivers, that means actually that at up in the mountains or at the uplands, the headwaters, these inputs from soils to waters are higher because you have quite a bit of CO2 processing in lakes and rivers, so there's a lot of CO2 that is emitted back into the atmosphere. So the inputs from soils to rivers and lakes is higher than the number we have here. Yes, so one of the other reasons why it's interesting to think about riverine export to coastal ecosystems, it's of course we have the carbon budget, but there's a lot of other things happening. As you very well know, the Oslo fjord is under threat. This is a picture of what they call lurv, which is a horrible mass of filamentous algae that resides on top of healthier ecosystem kelps. Kelp forest, and they are sort of buried in filamental algae, and that has a lot to do with nitrogen, but certainly also organic carbon inputs from surface from rivers play a role here. So this is an issue we're interested in at NIVA. Okay, this is. Then I would like to say, as I just mentioned, the lakes and rivers are hotspots of carbon processing. So the inputs from soils into the rivers are quite a lot larger than reaches the sea. And that means that the rivers and lakes, they send a lot of carbon back into the atmosphere. And that's used by microbes, but there's also photooxidation happening. But some of that also ends up in sediments. So it's probably not a very large flux, but it is certainly also a number that can be quantified and accounted for. So is this a static property, this riverine, these fluxes? What is happening? Well, I think some of you may be aware that lakes and rivers are browning. This is happening in Fennoscandia, but it's also happening in other parts of the world, in the UK and in Canada, North America. So these red dots indicate positive trends of DOC, dissolved organic carbon, and this it's a very big effect. And for instance, drinking water providers need a lot. They need to work a lot harder to remove humus from the raw water sources to provide the drinking water. It can have doubled or tripled. So it's a very real effect. So why is this happening? Well, cleaner air. As during the 70s and 80s, there was this the acid rain story that we don't hear a lot about because it's a problem that has been very well dealt with by international policy. So to reduce emissions of sulfur and nitrogen to the atmosphere. So what you see here are lots of monitoring data. Each dot is a lake or a river in parts in many countries in Europe and also Canada and the US. And what we have measured there is sulfuric acids, and that's basically sulfate that comes from the atmosphere, and it lands and then it's washed out into the... And so these are negative trends. And so there's, whereas the TOC trends are positive. So you see like where sulfate is going down, DOC is going up. So it's a chemical control basically of DOC, and it's a titration, if you will, and reducing the acidity of soils makes organic matter more soluble. So this is actually a very well-known principle for the mentioned drinking water providers. But for the future, since air quality has improved a lot, this effect is not expected to impact future DOC a lot more. Yep. So what is also happening is, of course, we have talked about droughts, but there are also quite some suggestions that part of Norway is becoming wetter. It's actually the warming trends are very clear, but the other ones are a bit less clear. But what we see in regions, in most regions, that wetter years lead to browner waters. So this is, and drier years, vice versa, less DOC. This is because of hydrological export through the topsoils. So more rainfall also means just more water into the surface waters, and that means that the fluxes of DOC will be increasing. So, and leading to returning to the question, will more carbon be lost from soils? Basically, because this carbon comes from soils, it seems that is reasonable to assume. The question is that also going to impact the remaining organic matter in the soil? And this is something we will address in Norsink. And then there's also the questions about more carbon being released from rivers and lakes to the atmosphere. Very likely so. So this is going to be exciting to work on that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Helene. Very exciting. Then we will follow the river all the way to the coastal area and to the sea. And we saw from Glenn's figure that the oceans are really the big, storing the big carbon pools. So I'm very glad we have Helene Muri here, senior scientist from NILU, who will talk about the oceans and what they can provide for us. So go ahead.
Thank you, Kjetil. Yes, so now we're moving on to the oceans. We're going to have a look at first how the oceans are taking up carbon, how that is changing, and what the oceans could potentially do for us going forwards into the future. So the oceans have so far taken up about a whole third of our anthropogenic emissions so far. And this can be done in multiple ways. One way is the solubility pump, where CO2 can be solved into the oceans through chemical reactions, where the carbon then ends up as dissolved inorganic carbon, as we call it, which is the major pool of anthropogenic carbon within the oceans. Then there is also the biological pump, where things like phytoplankton, they grow through photosynthesis and take up carbon that way. The phytoplankton will either be eaten or die and decompose and go down into the deeper ocean. Then there's the carbonate pump, where you have organisms like zooplankton and shellfish and so on that utilize carbon to build calcium carbonate shells. And these kind of shells will eventually get typically buried into the sediments of the oceans and be stored for a very long time. Then there's also physical mixing. So you have winds and waves that cause these kind of air-sea gas exchanges. The carbon will be moved around within the ocean, whether it is the overturning circulation, upwelling or downwelling, or wind-driven currents as well. So that means that, within Norway, we will be importing carbon, but we will also be exporting carbon through the ocean as a fluid. And we are adjacent to a very important part of the carbon cycle, because typically between Iceland and Svalbard, you have a lot of downwelling, so you have this overturning, so you have formation of North Atlantic deep waters. So the surface waters that have been in contact with the atmosphere taking up our emissions are then being transported into the ocean interior in this region. In this figure here, you can see the darker blue colors in the North Atlantic, and this signifies then a strong carbon uptake. So this is not just from the overturning and circulation, but it's also due to large springtime plankton blooms and waters turning colder in the winter. So colder waters are more able to take up carbon. So you have this kind of holy trinity of carbon uptake in the North Atlantic. So the net open ocean flux globally is about 1.8 gigatons of carbon per year, and the coastal and high latitude contributions is about 0.4 gigatons of carbon per year. The trends are a little bit more concerning, though, because the oceans are getting a little bit less effective at taking up our emissions. So the oceans are not quite able to keep up with the amounts of emissions, because we have been increasing and increasing our anthropogenic emissions. But warmer waters and more acidic waters are less able to take up carbon, so the solubility pump is becoming slightly less efficient. And then there are some circulation changes where the warmer waters become more stable, so you have less downwards transport of the carbon that's been taken up, including to this sort of slightly stronger currents that are getting weaker as well. But the ocean is still strongly taking up carbon, don't get me wrong, but we need to keep an eye on what's happening. So through these kinds of map, you can see that our part of the world has a fair amount of in situ observations. So we're quite lucky in that part. So in this project, we will look at observations within our region and quantify the carbon uptake historically, and also going into the future using models. Unfortunately, though, about over the last decades or so, the amounts of observations from the ocean have about halved. And this is concerning, especially because of the recent political attitudes in the US, as the US have been funding a lot of the oceanic observing systems. So some are also investigating how to utilize the oceans proactively to remove more carbon. Then we arrive at things like marine carbon dioxide removal. So how can we enhance these natural fluxes and make the oceans take up more carbon? just to mention a couple of these methods from this schematic. We have, for instance, macroalgae cultivation, so you can cultivate macroalgae like kelp, grow it and either harvest it, or you can sink it and bury it in the deeper ocean. Then there are also ocean alkalinity enhancement, as we call it, where you can add things like quicklime, for instance, spread that across the ocean surface to enhance the solubility pump, so increase the chemical uptake and dissolve more carbon into the ocean. So we will also be doing some modeling activities within the NorSync project to investigate these kinds of methods within a Norwegian context. So to wrap up, the oceans have done us a huge favor and taken up a lot of our emissions so far, but this sink is not infinite, and it's showing some early signs of strains. So we need to get on top of this. We'll also do some modeling activities and look at marine carbon dioxide removal methods. And yeah, we're just happy to get this project started. So thank you for your attention.
Rosie has already gotten up, so next one out is Rosie Fisher, senior scientist at CICERO. I think we will move back to the land and the forest, but you will also more broadly touch upon how we use models in this project. So, yes. Rosie, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm talking about the use of models to better understand the future, the Norwegian forests and the carbon balance in general. I'm not going to talk in a huge amount of depth about the sort of insides of these models. I want more to kind of address the sort of philosophical basis of this project in terms of the fact that we're kind of moving we're kind of trying to marry two historically quite different ways of viewing the carbon cycle. So kind of elaborate on that. When we think about the future of Norwegian forests, these forests will be subject to lots of different simultaneous changes in their environment. And if you're a plant and you have to your job is basically standing still for maybe 6 or 7 decades, these changes are pretty substantial to your worldview. So in the future we'll have higher temperatures and higher carbon dioxide. Those we kind of think will generally increase the growth of these forests, but as Ryan discussed, we'll have more droughts, more fire, more insects, and these things will tend to reduce the carbon store. And so our job is to sort of think hard about what the likely balance of those processes it might be. And the thing is that these conditions, essentially none of them exist in the present, right? So these are all very fundamental drivers of forest growth and the carbon cycle. And so we can't really, when we're thinking about the future, we can't really just use observations of what happened to forests in the past, right? So what forests did in the present and the past is interesting for our understanding, but it's not necessarily going to be all that useful for looking many decades into the future. And so I'm an system modeler. The sort of philosophy that I sort of was trained in is this. So trying to understand how plants and soil actually function, right? So that we can think about how they might function under unobserved circumstances. And so the way that we do this kind of activity, as Norbert described to some extent, is that we do lots of kind of detailed observations and experiments on how plants work and how ecosystems work. So this is someone measuring the carbon dioxide exchange of a leaf, and so the models that I work on are kind of built on relatively detailed understanding of the processes that drive photosynthesis and evaporation and carbon allocation inside of plants using these kind of relatively high-tech instruments. And also we look at the same things on the landscape using the flux towers to try and understand in relative detail, what happens to ecosystems when the sun shines, when the wind blows, when the temperature changes. And so we can turn these kinds of observations into mathematical representations of of ecosystems. And so this is what we call a light response curve. So what we understand from these measurements is that when the light increases, photosynthesis, first of all, goes up pretty steeply, and then it kind of levels off at a high rate when the plants are photosynthesizing well. But if you increase the light too much, we get these sort of a downturn where the plants have to deal with that. And this is just one example of a lot of different ways in which we can kind of interrogate the processes happening at the ecosystem level. And like I said, this subject is called ecophysiology. It's a relatively obscure academic discipline, but it's the kind of the basis of how our predictions work. And so what we've been doing in my field for the last couple of decades, I guess, is building all this understanding into these big representations of how the land surface of Earth functions, right? And those are called land surface models. And this is a sort of schematic diagram of what's inside of a land surface model. We think about lots of different, how lots of different things all interact with each other. And so probably the first thing we think about is how energy comes from the sun and how it's reflected by some surfaces, absorbed by some of the surfaces, and obviously used by plants to take up carbon dioxide. We also think about the hydrology of the system. When the rain falls, how much of it hits the leaves and is evaporated, how much goes into the soil, does it drain away? We have root depth, and that takes up water from different depths in the plant, and then the plants control how much water they evaporate. And some of that is physics, and some of that's biology, and we have all these things kind of tied in together. And then we think about the carbon cycle, like Tarja discussed. We think about how much carbon's coming in to the plant with those light response curves. We think about what the plant does with it. Does it put it into wood or leaves or roots, and does give any of those to fungi, and then it goes into the soil and decomposes. So all of these things are kind of operating all at the same time in our simulations. And so using this understanding, we can and do make global scale predictions of responses to change, responses to CO2, temperature, drought, and so on. And that's what we do when we run climate models, right? All the things that I described run inside the Norwegian Earth System model and other platforms. But there's a problem with the philosophy that I just described. So that's how we've historically, in my field, run Earth System models. But what we tended to do is, on the left-hand side of this picture, is oversimplify how actual ecosystems actually work, right? So in traditional land surface models, we sort of divide up the land into different plant types like this, and then each plant type we kind of have like a few boxes basically to determine what the carbon looks like. We have a box for leaves, box for wood, and so on. And that's not a very easy thing to think about ecosystem function. It's very easy to link that to the observations that Christine described about forest growth and so on. On the other side, sort of the tradition, the philosophy of the forestry sector, the tradition of the forestry sector has come out of this idea of simulating individual trees, but based on kind of what they did in the past. And so what we're trying to do in this project is kind of marry these two traditions, and we're using this kind of model called a demographic vegetation model, where we, instead of simulating boxes, simulate individual plants, or groups of plants called cohorts. And so in our new project in NorSync, what we're going to be doing is finding ways to link our new type of Earth system models, where we can represent plant ecology, with all the data in the forest inventory, and in the soil observations and the river runoff and so on. And so the idea is that we sort of build this capacity to learn from ecosystem data. And it's worth saying that this is quite a novel project internationally, right? So our idea is we did this in Norway, and we paved the way for this kind of thing to happen elsewhere, and kind of roll out a more kind of process-based understanding of the future. And so, just lastly, we're growing this community for process-driven land carbon prediction in Norway, and it involves lots of different institutes and people and individuals, and it's very important we build up this expertise across all these different domains, and it's all looking very promising. So I'll stop there. And let the discussion continue.
Yes, thank you, Rosie. And I'll ask you to move over to this side.
I will move it to
and
the side.
we will and invite the other three talkers up here.
Actually.
I just want to mention while the others are joining the stage here that Rosie showed all of these people, but this project NorSync is also about building the Norwegian carbon modeling community and monitoring community and integrating it better. So we will have annual meetings, we will have more outreach activities like this, and we want to engage with the broad community, just to say that. Before we kick off this final discussion, I think I will open up the floor first. Just anyone who has a question for any of these 4 talks. Yes, there are 2 questions.
Okay, Line Venn, Norwegian Forestry again. It's mainly to Rosie, but maybe more of you would know. I just wonder if some of these projects that you are doing now and are planning to do will is now giving more information about the soil carbon in the forest and how the forestry is influencing the soil carbon, which has been a big discussion. Especially
what was the last part? How the soil is influencing the forest back again?
Yeah, the forestry. How the forestry is impact, especially the clear cutting. How will that impact on the forest soil?
I mean, the short answer is yes. And I guess the longer answer is a little bit more to do with what Harry was discussing. So in our project, we'll be kind of developing new capabilities to simulate the plant-soil interactions via microbial communities. And so yeah, Betty's working on that for her PhD at the moment. And the idea is that will create this new class of soil model, or elaborate on this new class of soil model, which is more able to simulate these more complex dynamics. Existing soil models are quite simplified in that they sort of imagine that the soil is just decomposing on its own without the microbes that actually affect decomposition. And so our ambition is to have this kind of model running and also to inform it and test it with litter bag studies and so on, and ultimately against the soil data that we have. Did you want to add that, Terje?
Yeah, so part of one sub-project here is to compare these more process-based models that I described with the standard model that is applied at NIBIO and is used for reporting. So trying to put it on the same level and being able to compare it. I guess that in the near future, we have a lot of parameters that need tuning, and it might not be working directly to be an improvement. But I think in the long term, this is the way to go, and that's why we are putting this effort into this. But it's an ongoing project, and it's very much in the forefront to have this more microbial explicit soil decomposition models to use it for inventories and study actually forestry management schemes.
Good, yep.
Thank you. Katrine Bjørnes from the Norwegian Environment Agency. Thank you for all your presentations. I have a question about emission scenarios in the future. When you are looking into the future in this NorSync project, will you be using any specific emission scenario? And if so, what are they? And in relation to that, I think a year ago I listened to you, Rosie, a presentation where you said that the forest will, in the future, might turn into a source. Now it's a sink, it will turn into a source. And what kind of, how far into the future is that? Thank you.
I guess the answer to this question is linked. So how far into the future that is depends to somewhat on the scenario which we follow. Yeah, I mean the point is that we don't know the balance of these processes, and so we don't understand confidently yet if and when if and or when the forest might turn into a sink, or even just to kind of reduce its capacity to zero. Specifically, to answer your question, we'll be using a range of different climate scenarios, from the sort of standard RCP databases, probably sort of in the kind of low to mid range, sort of 2.6, 4.5. We have many other projects allied to this one, where we're specifically creating new land use scenarios and trying to ingest more land use data as well. But yeah, our hope is to provide not just a number, but maybe a confidence interval on when we think, if we thought the forest would turn into a sink, when that might be.
I think also part of the interesting things in this project is that management is involved, and so what Norwegian forest looks like at the moment is also to a large extent determined by what forest managers do, and temperate forests. I mean, if we are moving towards a more temperate rather than a boreal climate, temperate forests usually have more carbon in the biomass and less in the soil, and that's of course like a space for time comparison. So we don't know if Norwegian forests are moving there, but that will not only depend on climate, will also depend on the choices that forest owners make.
Yeah, so we have important work to do in this project, understanding both the living biomass, but also the more tricky hidden soil biomass. We're going towards the end. I think we need to, if we are going to stay on time. I just wanted to have a final comment from you, Helene, on the bit more controversial topic of what can we do to mitigate. And you mentioned some of these ocean negative emission technologies. Where are we with this, and what's the prospect? Is this science fiction, or can you comment?
Yeah, so for instance, for Norway, we do have kelp farms already, right? Yep. Along the Norwegian coast, there are different kinds of projects, quite a few of them, who are already growing kelp. But that's predominantly for food. So you can buy crisps flavored with kelp, or gin flavored with kelp, and so on. But in theory, you can use this kelp to sink it instead, or store the biomass durably instead of keeping it within the sort of fast carbon cycle. So for that, I mean, kelp for marine CDR is not happening at a large scale anywhere, but we're in theory not too many steps away from doing it, but we don't really have a clear picture of how long the carbon is stored for. So for marine CDR, the monitoring, reporting and verification part of it is quite important, and that means we need to get the monitoring right, especially as a first step. For ocean alkalinity enhancement, there are some projects, in particular in the US, where they are putting things like olivine on the beaches to prevent erosion, and at the same time take up carbon. How much carbon is being taken up, I don't know. But we have places like Kalk, this lime industry in Norway that could potentially provide lime for ocean alkalinity enhancement within Norway, but it's not happening yet. But we have done some outdoors experiments in a previous project in mesocosms, as we call it, like big tanks in the fjord outside of Bergen, where they measured the impact on fish, and the cod in particular seemed quite happy about the ocean alkalinity enhancement in this specific test in a tank. But these kind of observations need to be verified and continued. Yeah.
And you're well placed to stay on top of what's happening in all of these CDR, and especially ocean CDR activities, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so we don't have all the answers, but we're in the beginning of a 4-year project, so we are very happy to dive more into this, and we will give you the updates as we no more. So stay tuned. I guess all of you who managed to pick up this event will also manage to get the information on the coming events, typically annually or more frequent. Thank you for coming.